Hello and welcome to the latest live stream from the Permaculture podcast to examine bushfire safety, specifically the work by Joan Webster and her book, Essential Bushfire Safety Tips. I've got my intern, Duke, with me here today, hanging out with us while we work through this. So if you hear him meowing, I will be giving him pets while we're here together today. But yes, we'll be looking at Joan Webster's biography and background when it comes to bushfire safety, then look at the book itself, Essential Bushfire Safety Tips, and some of the recommendations that she makes. And then at the end, look at lessons for permaculture and how we can adapt these ideas to our work every day. All right, Mr. Duke, let me sit you down. So this is the author of Essential Bushfire Safety Tips and other books on bushfire safety, Joan Webster. Joan, though she's now in her 90s, is a writer whose work stretches back over 6 decades, with the last 40 of those years spent deeply exploring bushfire safety and what people can do to keep themselves and others safe when bushfires occur in Australia. Her first work on this subject was the Complete Australian Bushfire book, published in 1986, which was shortlisted for the BHP Pursuit of Excellence Award in 1987, and she followed that up with the Complete Bushfire Safety book and Essential Bushfire Safety Tips in the years that followed, all of which have been credited with saving lives across Australia and within the Australian community. There, buddy. And for this work on bushfire safety, Joan also received the Australian Fire Protection Association's Community Service Award in 1990 and the Order of Australia Medal in 2010. And Joan continues to write on a myriad of topics, from poetry to the roots of festival customs to this day. The book, though, that brings us together for this conversation is Essential Bushfire Safety Tips, which is now in its 3rd edition and was recently released from Meliodora Publishing. And that forms the basis for the rest of our conversation today for this live stream. And what I like about this book in particular is that it is clear and concise. It gets directly to the topic. Joan walks us through what we can do to better understand bushfires and how they happen, how they're dangerous to us, and then gives us a series of steps in order to protect ourselves in the future. And that throughout, these kind of principles are used over and over again to organize the book. That when it comes to our overall safety, that we need to be prepared before anything happens. That we need to think about this idea and then break down what is it that could occur. What can we do to get ready for whatever happens? Then, as we put those preparations in place, to have a series of plans that we can work through in order to be able to, if we decide to shelter in place, what is our plan for that and what does it look like? If we know or decide that we need to evacuate, how do we do that? What does that look like? How do we get ourselves out of a space and to a location that is safe? And then to be practiced, that it's not helpful just to prepare and plan. We also need to make sure that we do these things so that If we have an evacuation route, have we driven it? Have we thought about that? If we're going to shelter in place, do we have the food and water that is necessary, and do we know how to prepare and use that in the case of emergency? It's one of those things from my background in disaster planning and disaster management. You can find all kinds of items to buy that are sold in order to prepare you for a disaster, but like if they're freeze dried foods, how are you going to rehydrate them and eat them if something happens? And that's one of those pieces that I really like about this book, is that Joan walks us through these kinds of thoughts over and over again. And then with the be cleared, be clothed, be contained, that be cleared in the case of bushfires is about making space around us. That makes it harder for embers to jump to our homes. It also speaks to keeping ourselves cleared with what is going on. To be clothed, that it is examining not only the space where we might be sheltering and considering how to clothe that properly to keep embers out or to keep a fire from catching on our roof, but also how to keep ourselves clothed if we need to be outside in the fire as it's occurring around us, so that we are not wearing something like nylon clothing which could melt, or other synthetics which could melt if an ember is on us. Making sure that our clothing is not fuzzy, so that if we are outside and an ember falls on us, that the flames do not burn up our clothing and into our face. But also so that when we do go outside, that we are covered in stout clothing that will help protect us from the fire. And Joan gets into a lot of that. She also talks about the creation of your own preparedness kit, and highly recommends a 100% wool blanket because of the ability for that to protect us if we need to wrap it around us, or if we need to cover our head with it, because 100% wool garments are not likely to catch fire, and that small embers and other items that might fall on it if we're in a disaster could go out and be naturally snuffed. And then be contained, being able to have a space where we can safely contain ourselves, as well as working to contain a bushfire or wildfire in an area. And just Joan revisits these principles time and time again throughout the book. And I like this principled approach because it fits very well with permaculture as permaculture practitioners, and is easily adaptable to what it is that we're doing. And throughout the book, I also like it because the information is broken down into short, concise chapters throughout. At under 200 pages, I think the longest chapter is around 10 pages, and they are focused around some of these topics that you can see here. She opens up so that the first 4 chapters that we have available to us address bushfires, understanding how they occur, what they are, how they kill people, what is involved in surviving a bushfire, and also understanding how bushfires destroy our homes. And from there, she also addresses how a home is a haven. And I think that thought is really important, because when I look at disasters in the United States, a lot of times people perish because they stay in their home. But I also understand the feeling of comfort and security that a home provides, as well as having everything around us that is helpful to our existence, or also being conscious of the fact that many people in our society don't travel well for various reasons, and to think that everyone can just evacuate, I feel, is a bit of an ableist perspective, and so we have to remember that. And so thinking about creating a space that people can rely on to be in should a disaster happen. And yeah, Joan gives a lot of information on how to prepare a home to be a haven if we decide to shelter in place. And yeah, from there, looking at chapters like 6 through 9 are about a protective blank. I put it that way because the ideas are that we can have a protective home site, that our property layout can be protective, that our garden can be protective, as well can be our home design itself. And each of those are divided out with explicit advice on how to prepare in that way. And as I'm working through this, if you are watching this live and have any questions about any of these specific chapters or topics, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I will browse to those chapters and share some more information with you. Don't mind me as I pet the intern. Yeah. And I really appreciate this idea of chapters dedicated to creating protective spaces around us, because there are so many examples of what we can do to make these spaces functional for us. Hey, buddy. And then use that to protect ourselves in the case of a wildfire. And I look at that then on how could we do those same things for other disasters. So like with that idea of a protective garden, let me hop to that chapter real quick. So like in the example for the chapter on a protective garden, it begins with the idea that there are 3 core aspects of a protective garden: the distance of flammable vegetation from buildings, distance from individual flammable plants, distance between individual flammable plants, and an absence of ground litter and clutter. And looking at that, when we go through our garden for a fire, those are some additional easy principles that we can work from. That if we're in an area that is fire prone, then it may not be functional for us to use wood paths in the chips as a permaculture practitioner. That gravel or a close mown lawn, or like a living path with something that will handle being walked on, like clover or grass, would make for a better path between our gardens. That if we're going to have any fences or outbuildings in our garden, that they should be made of a durable material that won't catch fire or melt. That if we are going to have an outbuilding, it should also be built with the same ideas in mind as when we build our home, in order to make sure that it does not catch a flying ember and catch fire. And all of those things together can help us create a garden that is protective in a bushfire situation. And from my experiences living in a flood zone, though the home itself was well outside the flood area, thanks to the way that the land was elevated, with how the waters came through, taking these ideas that Joan shared and adapting them to a different disaster and using permaculture planning, our neighbors had a series of trees that caught a lot of the large heavy debris that came through when it would flood, because the waters would start in their yard and then come through the property that I was on. Their trees would catch a lot of the large pieces, but we would still have a lot of waste come through. Tree branches, toys, like anything that water could pick up and float. Found diapers and other things in that wastewater. from the flood, and so planted a thick row of brambles to act as a hedge. So when that water came through, it would catch that debris and make it easier to collect and keep it from falling down further in, flowing further down the river into the Susquehanna. And yeah, like those kinds of things really came together. Ms. Mills, I see your note about what was fire resistant. Yes, wool is a great idea. There are a lot of places now that are selling wool clothing pretty reasonably. Other natural fibers like cotton and linen are also less likely to catch fire, but they can ignite. Of my preferences, if I needed something heavy, I would start with wool, then linen, then cotton for clothing. But definitely don't run outside when there is a fire in nylon or polyester, because those are very likely to melt if they catch an ember. And they can also, because many of them are derived from fossil fuels, and oil can burn. And yes, even without catching fire, those materials can melt against our skin and create some pretty horrific burns. Hi, buddy. Here, let me get you back in my lap then. And yeah, continuing this conversation about the chapters in the book, I also like that she included these ideas of planning ahead and township protection and protective chores, because it includes more of those ideas of us taking the time to look into the future. And, you know, very often we wind up planning for the last disaster. Like that's even an issue in disaster management and crisis planning, that the last disaster gives you the most recent information on what could happen, and so that's what you plan around. But as we look at climate change and where things could go, what if we're forecasting out further and further? And then as we do that, what about for that township protection, getting involved in our community and being a part of that space so that we can help our community prepare for disasters and think about what might occur where we are, and get involved in the local process to talk with our township supervisors or however our municipality is governed, to talk to those people, attend those meetings and say, hey, you know, here are the issues that have occurred and can occur. What can we do as a community to plan around them? And Joan provides suggestions in Essential Bushfire Safety Tips around that. And then those protective chores. What can we be doing regularly to make sure that the space that we're in is protected and we are taking care of this incrementally and over time, so that clutter doesn't start to build up in our garden? That if we're in a place with wildfires and doing bushfire or wildfire prevention, going around and making sure that any eaves or entrances where embers might blow through are properly screened so those embers can't get into that space. Mowing our lawn or reducing the flammable plants that could easily catch, maintaining a safety zone around our home. But also things like making sure we keep fuel in our vehicle if we need to, in order to evacuate should something happen. And like from that, it also allows us to be better prepared if there is surge pricing, or if it is an issue over a large area that we can get further away from our immediate space if need be. And then that chapter on evacuate, defend, or shelter. As someone who has lived in spaces that flooded, this is a big question. Like, when do you leave? When do you make that choice to not stay where you are? And having been in that position, it can sometimes you can wind up in a place where the situation you're in can change rapidly and you can't evacuate. Or depending on the type of the crisis, you can't defend from it, so you have to shelter. And being, as you look towards the future, being prepared for those options and making decisions around the choices that we have when something like this occurs. And then finally, I like that Joan wraps up with brings us towards the end with this chapter about what to do when wildfire threatens, and shares with us kind of a comprehensive approach to consider this question and step through what we do and how we do it. Overall, for this book, I think what's really good from it is that it is, as I said earlier, it's clear and concise. Each of the chapters are a series of bullet points and short approaches that give us an idea of what the topic is going to be under the main subject for the chapter, how, some principles to use around this idea where we are in the moment so we can understand it better, and then a series of suggestions on what to do. I also really like that Joan addresses some of the factors that we might not necessarily think about all the time, depending on what our own situation is, such as remembering that when we are working within our community or thinking about plans, that not everyone's going to have access to transportation, such as a car, in order to evacuate. So if we are someone with transportation, then making those connections with our neighbors and being in a place to help them when a disaster strikes. Looking at our own situation, and if we're on the other side of that and don't have access to transportation, then what can we do if we need to evacuate? Being able to research and look into those options. And all the different ways that this book serves as a reminder of how to be prepared, be planned, and be practiced. To be cleared, be clothed, be contained. And because the book is written around these principles, Joan continually returns to them and makes it very understandable within the context of a permaculture practitioner, because we know principles, we know how to dig into these kinds of things. And so I'm definitely going to adapt the be prepared, be planned, and be practiced into my work when it comes to planning for other disasters, and then be looking for other core ideas that work for those disasters. I don't know what I would put in the place of be cleared, be clothed, be contained for a flood, but I will certainly work on it and get some ideas together so that we can have that kind of a triplet for that as well, as I think about those pieces. But I also like this book because of everything that Joan walks us through, and because of frequently reiterating this, that we can be secure in a variety of different ways in different situations, but that in order to do so, we need knowledge and experience to get there. So once we start preparing and start planning, to practice what we need. And if there's a piece that we are not clear about or don't understand, get the knowledge. Go learn the lessons that you need to in order to be ready for a wildfire or a bushfire or other disaster. And then build your personal experience around it, so that if you need to evacuate, drive your route. If you know that you might need to go outside in hot weather in heavy clothing to protect your property or where you live, put some of that clothing on, walk outside, see what it's like. As you use these items, then you'll know what works for you and what doesn't. You can more deeply prepare yourself for the future and the eventualities that could emerge. And yeah, writing around that, I just think it's really great that Joan did that, because we learn really well through that. Excuse me. Through that repetition, not only to hear it, but also to engage in it. And the more that I work through Joan's book, I really, really like it, because there's so much from it that I feel is relevant to permaculture practitioners, and adapting our the ideas within this book to our own practices and what it is that we need to do, especially in the potential looming issues with climate change, that we need to be looking to the future. We need to be paying attention to what is happening now on the ground, not only where we live, but also other places around the world, so that we can understand how other peoples and other communities are preparing for heat waves and increasing temperatures, because there are many spaces that are okay now that will have to adapt to this in the future. I also like Joan's book because much of what's in the book we can use to prepare for disasters immediately. There's stuff that we can put into practice right now that would be really helpful, that can make our lives easier, whether we're concerned about a bushfire or not. That we can create an emergency bag and keep it near our door so it's always up to date if we have to head out quickly. Or, that's something that we can get used to picking up and carrying with us to work, or throwing in the trunk of our car so that it's available should a disaster strike when we're not around. That we can keep our computers backed up in a way that gets our most important data off-site, or our hard drives, or have like a backup hard drive that's easy to locate and grab, so that we can get that, throw it in our emergency bags we go out the door. And I also think that Joan's book is really good at taking the long form traditional permaculture answer of "it depends," and allows us to create a number of useful questions that can then generate a list of thoughts that we could give to someone to meet them where they're at and help them based on their existing knowledge and experience. That we can give them information that allows them to pick and choose how to do this work in a meaningful way and make differences that make their lives easier. I also like that Joan's book covers these risks for bushfires, but that we can use her book as a model to create similar lists based on her chapters for other disasters or issues, like a severe winter storm, or an extended power outage, or a heat wave where we might lose air conditioning. What are the options that we have? And it harkens back a bit for me to Toby Hemingway's The Permaculture City, in the way that he wrote about if you're not growing your own food or able to grow your own food for some reason, then you can use the zone model to create a tiered response to how and where you get your food. And I see that working really well with what Joan lays out in Essential Bushfire Safety Tips as ways that we can address these kinds of issues for ourselves, whatever they may be. And I further think about Rosemary Morrow and a conversation that we had around, if you have questions, that you should go back to your design. If your permaculture design doesn't answer the questions for something that you're working on, then go back and work on your design, because as you fill in those holes in because it points to holes in your design. If you go back to your design, fill in those holes, it will answer your questions. And everything that Joan wrote in Essential Bushfire Safety Tips reinforces a lot of that for me as a permaculture practitioner, and it makes me think about making sure that we talk about including disaster management and crisis preparedness in our permaculture discourse. Not only because it is something that we will have to face as practitioners in the future, but also because it makes our permaculture plan more holistic. And if we're going to use permaculture to build more than just gardens, then we need a big, full plan that extends beyond the borders of our landscape, beyond where it is that we may be living in the moment or working at a given time. And use those zones to plan out further and further and further away. And as you have time, fill them in, fill them in, fill them in. And finally, the last thing that I really like about Joan's book that I think is really helpful for permaculture practitioners is that it's a practical handbook for preparing for a bushfire. And I would like to see more practical handbooks in this format to talk about permaculture and the different ways that it could be applied to the other human domains. And I like this format, and I'd like to see more permaculture texts designed in this way to get information into people's hands in a usable way rapidly without necessarily needing all of the philosophy and principles and all the underpinnings that come from a PDC. We can write books that answer specific questions for folks in this way. And I just really like it. And overall, I think that Essential Bushfire Safety Tips, the 3rd edition from Joan Webster, is a great addition to anyone's library if they're a permaculture practitioner, whether you need to design for disasters or not. And definitely put this in your toolkit, add it to your library, and I think you'll be able to do a lot with it and learn a lot from it at the same time. But if you'd like to pick up a copy of it, there is a link in the description for this live stream to permacultureprinciples.com. If I remember right, because of geofencing, that goes automatically to the US store. But if it takes you there and you're not in the United States or North America, go to permacultureprinciples.com's website, click on the store, and you can find this book there. And thank you, everybody who joined me for this live. Ms. Mills, always good to see you, and I look forward to the next live stream in September. I'll be posting the times and topics for those to patrons at patreon.com/permaculturepodcast here in the near future. And if you're catching this on a replay, feel free to drop a comment. Let me know your thoughts. If you have questions or anything like that, let me know, and I will gladly answer them as I am able. So thank you all again for joining me. Take care. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe for more in the future.